All right. So here we have Georgia Life Alliance's Joshua Edmonds, ED now for 1 year, 2 years?
Since the end of the last year.
Since the end of last year?
Half a year.
Okay, brand
Newly
new
minted.
ED. So do you want to provide any comments or thoughts on the voting that we just saw on HB 481?
Sure. So, this is a really difficult issue for any of our lawmakers to deal with. As we heard in all of our committee hearings, this is a topic that I don't think anyone takes lightly. We're talking about, as legislature, balancing the rights of privacy and the rights of due process, the rights of access with the right to life of a child. And so that's a balance that is difficult to discuss when it's such a private and intimate issue in people's lives. But it's one that the state has a compelling interest to discuss. And so it was a very, very long process from start to finish when this bill was introduced to when it just had its final vote now. And I think you saw a lot of members who spoke for and against the bill that passions are deep-rooted on both sides. Not every Republican voted for, not every Democrat voted against, because I think that people have individual thoughts and concerns about this kind of legislation. So I was really happy to see how much time was given for both sides to speak and to have their voices heard. There were members on both sides of the aisle that I was talking with even until today who weren't certain how they were going to vote on the bill. And so I'm just glad to see that in the end there's a law that was passed that had compromise involved, that had discussion involved, and that I think even members who were uncomfortable with the initial version found themselves comfortable with the final version, because I think that's ultimately the kind of process we should have at the Capitol is nothing should be railroaded through and done just under the guise of an administration or a political party, but we should have open discussion and find a way that everyone is comfortable clicking the green button and that there's not shame or harsh words brought down against people who press the red button at the end. So.
And I don't know if you've had a chance to dive into the vote yet. I'm sure no one's quite done the full analysis.
Yeah.
But I noticed that it was 92, so it was one less than when it passed out last time.
Yes.
Any thoughts on that, or did any big names jump out to you as folks who voted differently or voted this time and didn't vote last time? Anything
Sure.
like that?
Sure. So I haven't seen the roll to know who all voted and didn't vote and voted no. I do know that we had 5 members who were voting yes that were not present today. 2 who were sick, 1 was traveling, 2 had some family matters that they had to attend to today, but the speaker didn't want to wait any longer to bring this bill up. So if this were yesterday, or if this were Tuesday, or if this were yesterday, then we probably would have seen this actually be more like a 97 vote to 78. And when I get a chance to take a look at who voted no and who was present, I'll have a little more insight on how that played into things. But I know that we have 5 people who were supposed to be here that weren't able to be, that were going to vote yes.
And what do you make in terms of the ACLU? I mean, I just got a press release emailed to me from the ACLU saying that they're going to sue. This is unconstitutional. We heard some of those comments on the floor. This is patently unconstitutional. What is your response to that?
So I think that one of the things that we've talked about with this bill from the beginning is that we're presenting a novel question that other states have not considered when this kind of legislation has gone to the courts. We're not looking at just limiting access to one medical procedure. We're talking about recognizing that there's a present person in the womb and that person has compelling rights that the state is recognizing in the law. And so when this goes to litigation, which ACLU said they're gonna file a lawsuit, when we do end up getting into court to talk about this, I think that the discussion is going to be a little different than we've seen in other states. I also think that our court makeup is going to make this a different conversation. Our state courts are a little bit more conservative. Our state Supreme Court was expanded by 2 seats in 2016, filled with 2 very conservative justices who tend to rule on pro-life issues very conservatively. We're also in the 11th Circuit of Appeals for the federal courts, which tends to be a little more conservative. So I think that's also why you see the 20-week law that was litigated and then the injunction was overturned. There wasn't an additional lawsuit filed because I think folks who opposed that law recognized that the courts weren't necessarily favorable to an appeal on that, overturning the injunction. So I think we're going to have a novel question when we get to the courts, and we're going to have a different court system than in states like Ohio or Iowa. So there's no telling the future, but I'll be really interested to see how the court cases play out, and my predictions they play out more favorably to this law than they have in other states.
And so the larger conversation that's happening is that states are sort of a place to test out sort of the legal arguments around different pro-life legislation before trying to push things just to the Supreme Court. Do you feel like that's an accurate assessment of why the bills sort of have differences? Do you see there being a national strategy at play here?
I think that's fair to say. Anytime there's a law that, we kind of call them serial bills. There's the same bill done in multiple states. And when you take the outcome of other states and even litigation from other states, and you look at your state, you kind of make changes to the bill before it gets filed, or you even take a different approach to the bill. Or another instance would be like SB 104 right now, called Simon's Law, is a bill that Georgia Life Alliance supports, and it deals with do not resuscitate orders placed on minor patients and requiring parental consent. This bill's been passed in several other states and heard in committee in more states than it's been signed into law in. But based off of the comments we heard in committee and the way that different groups were weighing in on that law in other states, we changed the way we approached the bill in Georgia before we introduced it. I think the same thing can be said for this law, that we wanted to make sure that we were presenting a question that was novel to the courts or that addressed the core issue, because most court cases on this issue are looking at the right to access to abortion, and a woman's right to privacy, a woman's right to equal access, and we wanted to make sure that we weren't just throwing another, peanut butter sandwich at the wall and seeing it stuck. We wanted to talk about the underlying issue, which is that there's a life in the womb that needs to be protected, and we need to respect the woman's right to privacy and right to access as well. That's why you see things about population count. That's why you see the tax code in there. That's why you see child support for a child in the womb in there. So that we're adding an element of support for pregnant women who are in need, and we're invoking things from our adoption law from last year. We talked a lot about the Rape Survivor Custody Act from 2016 in committee. So there's a lot of things that are unique to Georgia that framed how we approach this issue with this bill this year.
And last question for you. So one of the main points of opposition has been, talk of how outlawing abortion doesn't end abortion. It just means people seek riskier abortion, or rather, people with access to resources are able to go out of state and get an abortion, and folks without access to resources are going to resort to the sorts of self-aborting or back alley abortions that we saw pre-Roe v. Wade. What would be your response to those concerns that we're going to see an increase in maternal mortality and an increase in folks desperate to try to end a pregnancy who didn't realize that they were pregnant in time to legally obtain an abortion here?
Sure. So I actually disagree with the premise that we'll see higher maternal mortality rates, or that women who would have sought abortion if it was legal will continue to try to seek it when it is illegal. On the other hand, we're also not just trying to limit access to one procedure. We're trying to create a culture that respects life, that protects women, protects children, and that we promote healthy mothers and healthy babies in our state. So that's why we have things like the adoption and foster law from last year, the Rape Survivor Custody Act from 2016. That's why there's a child support provision in this law. There's a tax code provision in this law. That's why we're talking about not Georgia Life Alliance, but other lawmakers are talking about the Medicaid waivers law that was just signed by Governor Kemp. There's an overarching consensus to make sure that as we pass different kinds of laws that we're protecting and respecting women and children. And so if we can create a culture that supports women who are in pregnancies that they would otherwise not want to be in, by things like the adoption and foster law, through free nonprofit healthcare centers that can provide services at low or no cost, and provide counseling and materials and support to women in those sorts of situations, I think you'll end up seeing that we're not just limiting access to one procedure, but that we're creating a culture that respects and protects women, and that the support that women feel when they're in those difficult circumstances is so much so that they would feel more comfortable actually carrying a child to term, and either feeling empowered to care for that child as a birth mother that they keep, or feel confident and comfortable enough to place that child for adoption after they've given birth. So that's the end goal, and I think that we'll see that come into play over the next few years once this law goes into effect. We can see the other laws that we're passing continue to go into effect and have an impact in our culture. I think you'll see numbers of maternal mortality, numbers of abortion, and numbers of adoptions. Those numbers are going to fluctuate dramatically, I think.
Okay. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. I appreciate the opportunity.